All right, let's do this. Peanut, if you're staying in the room, no talking. Hello, and welcome to the PhotoWork podcast, the talky and touchy-feely version of my book, PhotoWork, 40 Photographers on Process and Practice. Hello, everyone. I'm Sasha Wolf, recording again today at the Bearsville Theater Complex in Woodstock, New York. Thank you, Bearsville. Always happy to be here. And don't worry, I'm joined as usual by my podcast co-parent, Father of the Year.
How's our baby doing?
How is our baby doing?
Doing well.
Daddy. That, ladies and gentlemen, is your guy. Your guy belongs to all of us. He's just the general father. That sort of sounds very, godly. Well, look,
It does.
if
Yes.
the shoe fits, don't be modest. Mr. Michael Chauvin Dalton. Hello, Michael.
Hello. That was a lot.
I'm in a generous mood. I woke up, the birds were singing, the sun was shining. I had my Wheaties. I actually did have Wheaties. And
That's great. Well, I'm a secret fan of grape nuts.
Okay, well, that's sort of perfect. Now you're going to think I'm lying, but it's true. I had a Wheaties grape nuts mix.
Aha!
I mean, you need the extra crunch, right?
Of course. You need that texture.
Yeah. I mean, there's something about grape nuts that when you finished a bowl of grape nuts, the amount of work that goes into it makes you feel like you've really achieved something.
That's right. It's a breakfast and a workout. Yes.
I think as I was eating my grape nuts, I was actually getting rid of whatever wrinkles I've developed on my face over the years.
That's
right. They were all smoothing out as I did my jaw exercises. Oh, boy, we are off topic again. Settling down. How are you?
Everything's good here in Rutherford, New Jersey. We're also getting some very nice weather. So, looking forward to enjoying that.
For all you Michael Chauvin Dalton fans, you now know exactly where he lives in New Jersey. So if you...
Well, I guess we'll know what kind of fans we have, won't we?
Dedicated.
That's right.
All right, I guess we have to talk about the show, which I'm happy to do because I really enjoyed this episode. So today's guest, I mean, after that intro, it's like... Talk about a hard pivot. Today's guest was the photographer, really interesting artist, Ron Jude. And I love talking to Ron. It was definitely, you tell me your thoughts, Michael, but it was definitely for me, a little different because Ron is a real conceptual artist. And,
yes.
Even though in some ways some of his work feels very traditional, his process is very conceptual, and he's just an absolute concept first, go out and try and put the puzzle pieces together type of artist. And so
absolutely,
it was really interesting having a conversation with someone like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that balance between making these what sometimes look like more traditional photographs and then his approach, which you talk about in depth, of this removing context and trying to represent things without sentimentality. That is so interesting.
Yeah, he takes things out of context. He's someone who is using archival work, which is very popular right now. He was sort of on the beginning of that wave trend and did some really interesting work. It's so funny. He's also has a project where he uses found photos, but they just happen to be found photos that he made when he was young, and then just totally taking them out of context. And he sort of plays around a lot with the concept of narrative and truth. And anyway, it was really fun. And he has a very long intro, as we joked around about a little bit last week on Alex's episode. So
oh, yes.
I don't think I speak for the first about 15 minutes. So don't be alarmed,
you
people.
didn't have to.
I'm there. I'm just listening.
It was great. Ron is very comfortable talking about the journey and the process and everything, and which was fantastic.
Yeah.
You just kind of sit back and listen.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, no, he's really in command of sort of his ideas about his work and photography, and it was a real joy. Anyway, well, we have really babbled as usual, so why don't we get to it? Michael, if you don't mind, please take it away.
My pleasure, and here is your conversation with Ron Jude.
Ron Jude, welcome to the PhotoWork podcast.
Thank you for having me on today. This is great.
Yeah, I'm really psyched that we worked this out. As you know, everyone gets to talk about their childhood on this podcast. Starts with a little bit of that. So if you could just give us your origin story and take as much time as you want, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, the origin story. So it's a bit meandering for sure. I was born in Southern California, just outside of Los Angeles, and my family moved to the desert, a place called Apple Valley, not too long after that. And that becomes relevant to the work if we get into talking about Lago at all. But that location and those early years in the desert in Southern California were interestingly formative years in terms of some of my sort of outlook on the world. When I was just about 5 years old, we moved to a very small town in central Idaho called McCall, which was at the time a mill town for my dad to take a job there. And I spent, the rest of my childhood there in central Idaho, which also became a pretty profoundly important thing to me, both in terms of my perspective on the world as well as, a lot of the work that I would do from about 1998 to 2012. So that became a pretty important touchstone for me. I went to university at the nearest university to where I lived. I wasn't somebody who was, looking to go to, make connections or anything. I was really, I was raised in a working class rural environment, and, the bigger sort of outside world, and certainly the art world, I hadn't given two thoughts to. So I did know that I wanted to go to college. So I went to Boise State University in Boise, Idaho. And because I did have a passing interest in photography, I had a camera when I was a teenager and took a darkroom class in high school. I took a introduction to photography class at BSU, my very first semester there. And that was my introduction to photography in the context of art. Up to that point, it was really just sort of about, the cameras and the lenses and playing around in the darkroom. But that first term of having photography in college, a big door was opened, and I suddenly sort of understood the medium for a much greater potential. But it took several years and a couple of major changes to my degree before I sort of landed on the idea that I actually wanted to pursue a life in art. And so I actually, at that point, after being a philosophy major, changed my major to Bachelor of Fine Arts. And through the really terrific mentorship of a couple of people in Boise, Brent Smith and Howard Huff, I set off on a course of being a photographer. After undergraduate school, which took me 5.5 years to get through because I was, working a couple of jobs while I was going to school, and I changed my major a couple of times. I was very ready to get out of Idaho, not because I hated Idaho, but because I just felt like I was of an age where, seeing something else in the world seemed important. And so I found an MFA program in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Was really just thinking about my life and what I wanted to do in terms of sort of an adventure. And what I wanted at that point was a culture shock, something that would sort of, jar me. And so I accepted a position in the MFA program at LSU in Baton Rouge and got exactly that. I moved from central Idaho to southern Louisiana, and I can't think of two more sort of radically different places in this country. And spent a few years there that were extremely important, studying with some people that I really admired. I had a semester with Andrew Roth, who came in as a sabbatical replacement. Andrew is now a dealer in New York on the Upper East Side. And that semester with him was full of epiphanies, and just the time that I spent with him and the things that he had us read and the conversations that we had really opened up photography for me in terms of its broader connections to the contemporary art world. And at about that same time, I started a friendship with John Gossage, who I met at PhotoFest Houston. I think that's what it's called. I haven't been there since then, but it was like 1990. And he was there giving a talk, and I was a big fan of The Pond. And so I sat in on his lecture and met him afterwards, and we struck up a great conversation. And I ended up the following December taking a train to Washington, D.C. from New Orleans and visiting his studio. And that became a really important relationship too. John really showed me a lot of work that I wasn't aware of, everybody from Joachim Brom to Volker Heinze in Germany. And from a visual standpoint, that was a really important moment in terms of understanding what else photography could be in terms of how to make a picture. So that was, those were all very sort of important, formative points along the way. After graduate school, I moved to Atlanta, which for no particular reason other than it was like the closest, fairly big city to move to. And while I was there, I was really lucky to sort of encounter a really great community of photographers, Connie Talkin, Stephen Shear. There were great people living there at the time. I was teaching at the Atlanta College of Art part-time, which is where I met Roe Etheridge. He was a student there at the time. We became great friends at that point. Chris Vereen was in the graduate program at Georgia State University, another place that I was teaching at the time. So there was all this sort of great stuff happening in the sort of mid-90s in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And it was just a great time to be there, especially as a photographer. There was a new curator of photography at the High Museum of Art, Ellen Florov. Jane Jackson had a really vibrant gallery in Buckhead called Jackson Fine Art. And it was like the perfect moment to arrive there. I ended up doing a show at the High Museum of Art with Ellen, did an exhibition and a few group exhibitions, as well as a solo exhibition at Jackson Fine Art with Jane. And it was, I was teaching at 3 different institutions, teaching over in Athens at University of Georgia, lots of conversations with Stephen Shear, who's an amazing photographer. And, it was this kind of perfect moment post-graduate school to sort of be a photographer and be in this community where a lot was going on and people really loved the medium. I mean, this is kind of my, brush with fame in terms of photography in Atlanta. I saw Harry Callahan a few times walking around with his camera. I met
That's
Eleanor.
Awesome.
Yeah. I met Eleanor at a Christmas party. She, gave me some cookies.
Harry's wife. Yep.
Yeah, Harry's wife, Eleanor. And yeah, it was just like everything kind of fell into place. Like the move to Atlanta was totally arbitrary, and yet it seemed like it couldn't have been any other place. And following Atlanta, I got to the point where I'd been teaching photography in 3 different art departments for like 4 or 5 years. And I got to the point where I didn't want to be, the guy just kind of hanging around forever, hoping that maybe somebody would give me a full-time job or, and growing bitter as I got older. So I thought, okay, I need to move on. I need to keep moving. So at that point in like 1998, I moved to New York City. Roe Etheridge had moved there about 6 months before. And so that kind of, got me interested in the idea of going up there. And when I was living in New York, I was, lucky enough to, meet and have conversations with Alice Rose George, who put my work on the cover of Double Take and a portfolio inside. Kim Caputo, who was running Blind Spot at the time, put my work. I had an image on the cover of Blind Spot and Double Take sort of back to back. So all of these sort of great moments of, what you would call like minor exposure at that point in my career were sort of, pretty important to me. And it made me feel like, okay, I could do this. I thought I was sort of learning and was beginning to understand, how to be an artist, even though, money was always a problem. But I knew who people were. I started to understand how the gallery system worked and how to get my work published. And so that, I was just sort of in the trenches, living very, very poorly, but, just at that point in my life, just absolutely loving being a part of something, being a part of that community in New York and in the sort of broader photo community. After a year of doing some editorial work in New York, which, that's what Roe was doing. Roe was doing editorial work and just starting to get into some advertising and fashion work. And so I thought I would give that a go, sort of stop teaching for a while and see if I could make a living doing photography while continuing to pursue my career as an artist. And I did that for about a year in New York. And I was just starting to get some traction, getting more and more editorial work when I sort of realized I don't really like doing this. This isn't what I like. This isn't what I like about the medium.
Yeah.
It's not that interesting to me. And, if I had to make a living on the side, I realized at that point that, teaching was probably the best option for me. It was the thing that I felt most comfortable with, and it kept me engaged with the medium on a sort of intellectual level that seemed important to me. So I took a teaching job at Ithaca College in upstate New York. And I was there for 16 years and, had tons of great interactions living in Ithaca and going back and forth to New York City. Really great friend and colleague of mine, Nicholas Molnar, was teaching at Ithaca College during the same time that I was there. So we've collaborated on several projects. Michael Ashkin and Leslie Brack, both incredible artists, were both are still living in Ithaca. I kind of got into the trenches of teaching for quite a few years there, and although I was still continuing to make work and show work, the career part of it started to wane a bit. I wasn't getting as much traction. I think I was, the work I was doing, I was really kind of doubling down on the kind of like esoteric nature of what I was interested in. And, I was still doing things to a certain extent, but I wasn't necessarily, the career wasn't arcing necessarily the way I wanted it to. In 2006, a really sort of important thing happened. I had a body of work that I was working on where I was appropriating images from my hometown's weekly newspaper. And I'd been kind of collecting and working with these images for about 7 or 8 years at that point. And I still wasn't sure what to do with them. And I had this idea that they seemed best suited for like a book. And I hadn't published any books at that point, so I didn't really know what that world was about or how to get that done. And I paid a visit to Andrew Roth in New York, and because he was involved in publishing as well as his gallery. And he advised me that although he wasn't interested in publishing, that it was worth doing and that I should publish it myself and just make an artist book. That sort of gave me the sort of confidence and determination to make that happen. And in figuring out how to publish a book, which ultimately became Alpine Star, it was a really great experience, just sort of learning the mechanics of, how to get that done. Everything from the design work to finding a printer, working with a printer. And then, the hardest part, once you actually publish a book, which I know a lot of people who have self-published books have encountered this, what do you do when 500 books show up at your doorstep? The trick is at that point getting them out into the world. Mm-hmm. And that's, that became its own problem. But through that experience, my partner, Danielle Mericle, and I started an imprint called A Jump Books based on, the idea that that was an incredible learning experience. And now we could actually help other people that we knew who had sort of esoteric projects that they wanted to publish. We could act as facilitators to help them get their work published. And we did that for about 10 years and published about a dozen books by everybody from Isabel Everts to Nicholas Molnar to Michael Ashkin, Dan Torup, Sean Records. That became its own kind of side hustle, going to the New York Art Book Fairs every year, being a part of that community, which still to this day, in terms of my experience in the art world, is the best community there is in terms of just the sort of, the generosity that sort of exists amongst bookmakers. The stakes are lower. It's not quite as exclusive as the gallery community. And yeah, I'm, again, so happy and fortunate to be a part of that, especially at that time, that moment where suddenly there were just dozens of independent publishers popping up everywhere, and all of the sort of excitement around the book form. Like PS1 New York Art Book Fair, sponsored by Printed Matter, that was a big part of that excitement, I think. So the Alpine Star was this weird project in the sense that it consisted entirely of photographs that weren't mine, so it was entirely appropriated. Even though I consider myself to be sort of a capital P photographer. It was starting to get more exposure just because it was a book than any of my other projects. Printed Matter picked it up as one of their favorite books of the year and sort of showcased it at the very first book fair in New York that happened in the old DIA space. And through that, I started getting into the idea of the book form as a sort of viable way of sort of thinking about my work. And so I the next book I did with the ice plant in LA, a book called Other Nature. And then I did another book with them called Emmett, and it just started kind of snowballing. And those books just started to get more and more exposure. The ice plant had, Mike and Tricia had great distribution through DAP. And so suddenly these books were, really getting out into the world. At the time, Michael Mack was still associated with Steidl, but because Roe had a relationship with Michael Mack, he encouraged me to send my books to Michael, and I did, just as a matter of course. And without any real expectation around that, just to sort of share my book with somebody whose books I admire. And that ended up being a very fortuitous thing because Michael was interested in my books and sought me out at one of the book fairs in New York and, basically asked me if I was interested in working with him. And that became a really fruitful relationship. I've now published 4 books with Michael, my last one just a couple of years ago, and a couple of other publishers as well, Super Labo in Tokyo, Library Man in Stockholm. So book publishing for the past 15 years really was sort of at the heart of what I was doing. And all the while, at least since 2009, I've been working with Teresa Luizzati in Santa Monica. She's been representing me, and she's played a huge part also in maintaining my sort of role as an exhibition artist as well. So she's done a tremendous job of placing my work in institutional collections, connecting me with institutions to do institutional shows. Of course, I've done a number of shows with Teresa in LA, but I've also done museum shows that were due in large part to Teresa's associations with various curators. So that's been huge too. So it's, between the publishing and then having Teresa represent me and then Robert Morat in Berlin, it just sort of got to the point where it felt like I was really doing what I set out to do. And, in the beginning had no clue at all how to make that happen. But it, like I tell my students, just by showing up and being present and being engaged and being tenacious about just knowing that doing the work is important, I think eventually you get things done somehow. So that's kind of the long-winded the long-winded bio is probably longer than anybody's ever given you.
Well, then you will win an award. To be determined. Going to find a mug. So I want to just rewind. I know you're out in Oregon now.
Yes.
You've wound up teaching.
Right. I forgot that part.
Yeah.
I'm in Eugene, Oregon at the moment. Yes.
Yeah. So I want to rewind a bit to Alpine Star, which
Okay.
you mentioned, and this project, because it seems to me like this project sort of sets the tone for a lot of things that come after it. And sort of the most overt, profound thing about the project is that, as you said, you were using found photographs. You were using photographs that you'd pulled from the local newspaper where you grew up in Idaho.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you get to a point where this is what you want to be doing as opposed to making your own pictures, where you decide, wow, I'm really going to invest a lot of time in this project that doesn't utilize my own photographs? And I know you've talked a lot about what a picture can and cannot do and what narrative implications exist in a way that's problematic
Mm-hmm.
in an individual photograph. And so tease out a bit or talk a bit about this decision to all of a sudden commit to this project that's not your own photography, and that there's a real philosophy behind this decision and how you got there.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just to give a little context to sort of how I think about the medium, even though as I said, I describe myself as a sort of capital P photographer. My education consisted of, really photography in the context of contemporary art. And so I've really always thought of it as being in dialogue with a lot of other things besides just photography. Some of my favorite artists, were from the pictures generation, people who were really, looking at and thinking about the medium, not just as a sort of fine art medium, but also as this sort of cultural force, this thing that was interesting as a phenomenon and not just as an art medium.
You're talking about Sidney Sherman or Richard Prince, Barbara Kruger, people like that.
Definitely. All of those people, looking at one of the most profound experiences I had as a young person seeing an art exhibition was a Mike Kelly show that I saw where, I'm encountering people who are using photography who don't really think about themselves as photographers. They see it as an interesting medium that operates in a very particular way, and people respond to this medium in a very particular way, and that becomes the interest that they have in using photography. And so that was all.
They're not thinking of themselves as documenting the world or
exactly
coming from the tradition of documentary photography.
Yeah, and so that was, even though all along I was just sort of I was making pictures, I was a photographer, but I always thought of the medium a little more broadly than that. And I had these sort of philosophical ideas about how photography worked all along. And then when I started looking at these images from the local newspaper in McCall, Idaho, it was called the Star News, I saw something in those photographs that I thought could sort of turn up the volume a bit on my own thinking about my own work. And it had to do with these sort of, hanging narratives that I saw present in these photographs. And the photographs were of a very particular sort. They were images that were generated for mass distribution, at least as mass as a small town newspaper can be. But they were generated typically not by professional photographers, but by writers who just took a camera out to make pictures while they did the story, or even people, from the town who just sent images in who were sort of reporting on their daily lives or, events that they were involved in or whatever. And so there was a kind of vernacular tone to the images while at the same time they sort of existed in this kind of professional format. So they didn't particularly do a great job. I wouldn't call them, photojournalism by any stretch. And yet that's the context in which they, existed. And that just kind of fascinated me. And the more every week I would get this newspaper in the mail, and I kind of kept track of the images that struck me as seeming to have this sort of weird, stunted narrative to them that I felt really kind of existed in every image. And I kept thinking about, how can I exploit that? And so, like I said, it was a number of years of collecting these and thinking about them and trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I use these? before I sort of settled on the book format. I've said this before. I feel really fortunate that was the first book that I ever made, because what it really did for me was it sort of really made me look at and think about and try to understand the structure, the sort of narrative structure of the book form, and particularly as it pertains to a certain type of photograph, in a way that I think if I was dealing with my own images, I would have been sort of favoring, the concept that I was working with, or the sort of strictly visual aspects of the images. I think I would have edited things very differently. And that taught me how to deal with my own photographs when I turned my attention back to that and started making books of my own work. Mm-hmm. So that was, that was my interest in dealing with that material.
That book is sort of the headline, in a way, is the way in which, when things are taken out of context, they develop, entirely new meanings. Wouldn't you say? Or
oh, absolutely, yeah. And to a large degree, context is what delivers meaning in an image. And there's a kind of an alchemy that exists between images that get mixed together that forms new narratives. I think our tendency, our impulse when we're looking at photographs is to it's a narrative tendency. And I think ultimately photographs don't do a particularly good job at fulfilling our expectations of narrative. And so what we end up doing is, we embellish images with our own backstory, our own narratives, our own history, our own sort of cultural baggage. And I think if you can sort of take that as a device to use to sort of exploit those expectations, photography can be a really sort of interesting thing to play around with, not just as, image making.
I mean, it seems as though you've been doing that for a while, that you've done what you just described in many books, not so much in your last book.
Right.
But certainly in a good deal of the books that you've made over the past 20 years. I mean, it sounds like this is coming from the philosophy major in you in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What is it that's so compelling about that idea? Because of course, that's what we do with a photograph. Of course, we embellish, we bring our own life to it. And, human beings are story-centric. That's why we're so susceptible to the story. This always cracks me up when I'm starting to watch a television show or a movie, and the first person who we're introduced to, it's almost impossible to shake that person from being your protagonist, even if the film or television show doesn't ultimately want them to be the protagonist, just the fact that we saw them first.
Yeah, we sort of understand and recognize patterns, and that's part of our sort of...
And we're desperate, right, we're desperate to create narrative. It's like it's hardwired into us.
I think it's a matter of bringing some sort of order to the chaos of lived experience. It's terrifying to be alive, and I think that's why we have this impulse, is to give structure, to make it seem like there's some sort of purpose or thread through everything. I think that's what the idea of story is all about. And I think that's what's fascinating about it to me.
But you want to mess with that. I think of you almost during that time of the trilogy that you made, and we can talk about that, Emmett, Lick Creek Line. But there's almost like, you're being sort of a provocateur in this space. I don't know if you've moved away from sort of more emotional work, because I don't know if you ever made work that way, but you definitely center yourself in a space that's really theoretical and conceptual. And there is an element of, you sort of, it's almost like needling a little bit the classic photo world. I mean, do you see it that way? Did you feel that when you were doing the work?
On the one hand, yeah, I think that's a fair sort of assessment. On the other hand, I wouldn't say it was in a antagonistic way.
No.
I mean, it's definitely a world that I'm a part of, but I do feel like my interest in the medium for a long time has been in its more sort of epistemological underpinnings. Like, what can we sort of know and learn and understand about the world through surface, which is basically what photography provides, is a sort of surface understanding of things. What's interesting about not just the explicit things about an image, but the implicit things about an image. That seems to me where all the sort of fascination lies, and how it, really where it's sort of crackling and full of life is in that the connotations that are made through photography.
Why don't you tell folks a little bit about the trilogy, because it is really, I think, quite fascinating, particularly Emmett and another sort of way of using found images, although this time they were your own,
right.
which is really wonderful. But
oddly enough, yeah.
yeah, but still, nonetheless, in a lot of ways, also vernacular, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think Emmett has a lot in common with Alpine Star in the sense that they were indeed found images, but they were images that I made when I was in my late teens, a few from my early 20s, mostly photographs that were made prior to any real engagement with the medium as an art form. And so I was, truly just fascinated with the medium of photography as a way to sort of look at and record the world at that time. And most of the photographs in Emmett, which I sort of rediscovered literally in a shoebox at my mom's house in Idaho, most of them I don't have any kind of memory of making. They were so long ago. And so in that sense, I could sort of treat them as objectively as I did the Alpine Star images. I could sort of look at them and think about them in terms of taking however many, 40, 50 odd photographs that have nothing to do with each other for the most part, and finding a kind of thread to run through all of them and a structure, giving them structure, much like, going back to that idea of the chaos of lived experience, and finding a structure for that to sort of give us a sense of cohesion and a sense of stability. And so it was another experiment in just working with images to find form.
Are you finding form, or are you creating a sort of disjointed narrative?
I think it's both. I mean, when I say form in the context of a book, it's sort of like, narrative form, or the arc or the structure of the thing.
Okay, gotcha.
But definitely still, just I think even more so than Alpine Star, I was really starting to engage a kind of thwarted narrative, and it's not all just philosophical for me. I mean, there's also a sort of fascination with the idea of nostalgia and memory. And, at the time, I'm literally in the middle of working with the images from Emmett, and I see Inland Empire by David Lynch. And I'm thinking about these kind of people who play with cinematic narrative and structure, and kind of turn things on their end until they almost completely fall apart, but don't quite fall apart. And that's kind of what I was trying to do with those pictures, was like, how close can I come to a total implosion and still keep us on the road here?
These projects are completely dependent on, as we've said, I'll just say it more overtly, but these projects are completely dependent on the editing and sequencing. So, I've talked to a lot of people, and I know a lot of artists for whom, of course, this is like, duh, right, editing and sequencing, very important. A body of work, very important. But you, more than anyone I think I've encountered, there's almost, for lack of a better way of putting it, and I know this isn't precise, and I'll say again, in some ways until some of your more recent work, but it's almost like anti the individual picture. Yeah,
and I think that's really true. I mean, I when I give an artist talk, one of the things I talk about at the beginning is, thinking about a range of artists, but particularly, somebody like, say, Louis Baltz, who, will put a grid of, 56 images together, and it's 56 individual images, but it's a single piece, really. It's not, you don't pull one out and say, I like this one.
Right.
And so I think I've always kind of thought about this, a body of work really as the sort of the piece, and not just a bunch of pictures,
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, I feel like underlining that's just so important, because, a lot of people are in that space, but you're really at the sort of extreme end there. And I wonder if that's caused you any anxiety. I know you and Teresa have worked it out, but Has that caused you anxiety, or did it cause you anxiety at any point? Because it would make it hard to show the work. It certainly would make it prohibitive to have just a few pieces in a group show.
Yeah, I think that's probably the hardest part, is the group show thing. That's, then it's just a matter of, I've never felt like when I exhibit the work, especially the work of the past 15 years where the book comes first and the structure is sort of everything. I've never felt like I couldn't exhibit the work in smaller numbers, because I don't think you have to put the whole book on the wall in order to get it.
Right.
So it becomes a really tricky thing. Again, it's like, okay, how far down can I carve this before it completely loses its meaning?
Right.
And so that's, that becomes an issue. And I'm always more comfortable with a bigger space in a solo show, or at least a group show that allows me enough space to really do what I need to do.
Have you ever had a conversation with a curator who's wanted to show some of your work and said, we'll pick 3 pieces, and you're like, that's just not possible. It'll take the work so completely out of context, it'll lose all its meaning. You have to choose 6 or 10, or have you ever had that happen?
That's definitely a conversation that I've had. I can't really cite a specific example with a curator, because I feel like by the time it gets to that level, the sort of curatorial level, like, it's kind of assumed, and I think it's true, that most people kind of get my program, like sort of understand it for what it is. And, and Teresa, to her credit, has done a really good job of communicating that to people as well, even to collectors, which is like, okay, we have, like with Lick Line, for instance, I created sets of those that, basically there are a number of pictures that sort of inform each other, and they can go out into the world in that form.
Wait, make that more explicit when you say you've created sets. So it's not a portfolio, or?
No, it's not a portfolio. They're exhibition pieces. And I think there's a total of 7 of these sets, and they're not mix and match. It's sort of like the Baltz thing, where like the piece is the set.
You chose X amount of images, and if you want to buy work, and I'm going to say this really slowly because I think to people who don't know this work, we've now mentioned this body of work twice, and people are going to be like, what are they saying? It's Lick Line.
Yes.
Is the body of work. And I have a problem saying L's, so I may have just made that worse. But are you saying that there's a set number of pictures? Let's say I want to buy work from Lick Line. I go to Teresa, who's a great gallerist. I have to buy a specific 5 pictures or 10 pictures that you guys have worked out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
wow,
and there's a couple of sets that have just a few pictures, a couple have like 7. So it's sort of thinking of the work as context being the driving force behind the images, and each one is considered to be a piece. And I haven't done that certainly with all of the work by any stretch, but Lick Line, we felt that was sort of important with that work.
Wow, that is fascinating. I don't know really very many examples of that, but I'm all for it. I think that makes great sense. You've done so many projects that's a little tricky as far as trying to fit everything into the podcast. But I do want to talk about 12 Hertz because, and we can go back to Lago or other projects if you want to, because you may need to in order to talk about how you got to 12 Hertz. But 12 Hertz is definitely a very different, it's a real departure for you. So why don't you just tell people what that project is? It's your most recent project. And it's definitely, well, I don't know. It feels to me like it sort of raised your profile a bit. Not that it needed raising. Sorry, I hope that wasn't offensive. But it just,
No.
It feels like that book sort of was all over the place. And by that, I mean that I saw it everywhere. And it was easier to do an exhibition for reasons I'm going to let you explain. But why don't you take it from here?
Okay. Yeah, so it was a very intentional departure. As we've been talking about, I'd been working in the book form, since 2006, and that was really sort of at the heart of everything that I was doing and thinking about and just sort of operating in the publishing world. And, I'd gotten to the point by the time I got to Lago where the book was at the forefront of my thinking. The book structure, that was the end goal. That was what I was thinking about when I was making the work. And in 2017, 2 years after Lago was published, Michael Mack and I published a book called Nausea, which consisted of a project that I did in 1992 and exhibited at the Photographers Gallery in London. And it was the 25-year anniversary of that exhibition. And that work had really kind of never seen the light of day beyond that. A couple of shows here and there back in the 90s, but otherwise, it was still a body of work that I thought was worth having another look at. And so I put together a completely new edit of that work. And Michael was agreeable about publishing it. And at that point, I really thought I was feeling a little bit of book fatigue. As much as I have loved being a part of that, and I love actually digging in and making books, that process is amazing to me. I felt like I'd been doing it to the point where it wasn't quite as engaging to me as it had been. And when I published Nausea, I thought, okay, that kind of caps in my mind what I was sort of thinking as like a 25-year cycle of work. Going back, taking that early work, publishing it, I kind of felt like, okay, this is a pause point for me. And I was getting just sort of restless. So I thought I wanted to do something that was kind of a departure for me, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant. I missed thinking more about individual images. I missed, thinking about exhibitions before a book. And then there were a bunch of other things going on at the time. My dad died. Trump was elected, which just seemed, to this day, so sort of baffling to me. And yeah, the world seemed on fire to some degree. All of that sort of added up to me just sort of wanting to reinvent things a little bit. And so I started this project. Oh, and I had just moved to Oregon. That was also huge from the East Coast.
Yeah.
And I just started looking at landforms and the sort of geology of the state and kind of thinking about humans and our place on this planet, and certainly not specifically about climate change or anything like that. I've never worked that way. I don't do issue work, but I was definitely thinking about ideas that are sort of out there now, like deep time and all of that, and how that could be represented visually, and whether or not that was possible. And that's kind of how I always work. Is like I start with a basic question, like, can you do this? I never necessarily come to a conclusion or figure out that I've, solved the problem. But, the question is what drives the work. And so, yeah, I wanted to make work that you could take an image out and it could sort of do its thing on its own terms, or it could exist in a larger body of work and still sort of function that way, but not in such a sequential structure.
Can you describe what the project is a bit more for folks?
Right. Yeah, we haven't talked about that at all. That's not important. So I started by looking at basic landforms here in Oregon, things like welded tuff formations, lava tubes. The state of Oregon has this sort of fascinating diversity of landscape. It seems like a pretty young place, geologically speaking. So we've got, obsidian mounds. I wanted to look at the kind of, the raw materials of the planet and suggest sort of ongoing and constant change that completely falls outside of the human experience. And I started looking at tidal currents, the waves in the ocean, marine breakers, and eventually folded into that glacial movement, fresh lava flows in Hawaii. And, the biggest risk in my mind in doing this work, although I was at a point where I really didn't care, was, doing black and white landscape photography, which, when I was younger, I would have, if you'd told me I was going to do that, I would have been like, no way, that's, and I'm living in the West and I'm doing black and white landscape photography. It seemed, to really be flirting with some of the conventions of the medium of fine art photography in a way that made me super uncomfortable. But that was another thing I wanted to ask myself, which was, can I do this in a way that doesn't just sort of sentimentalize the landscape, that doesn't bring a sort of human narrative to the landscape, and that still has a kind of like a weight and attention to it that is aligned with all of my other projects that the spirit of it kind of seems the same. So those were the things I was kind of setting out to see if it was possible.
And you succeeded, right? Because they're not really traditional landscapes. I mean, there's almost no horizon lines or even sky. They're really tight on whatever thing you're looking at, whatever scientific, geological thing you're looking at. So they're in some ways quite claustrophobic. There's no real sense of scale.
Yeah, and that was all, part of the program and like conversations that I was having with, like Stanley Walakawanambwa was in Eugene a few years ago, and we looked at the work in the studio, and we sort of talked about those things and how those became important, not to anthropomorphize the things that I was looking at, to sort of give a sense of, a disembodied view through the sort of, a lack of scale. So those, as I did the work and I sort of picked up on these things and had conversations with people about the work, those became more and more sort of intentional and sort of built into the photographs.
Oh, not just a lack of scale, but a lack of sense of place, right?
Yes.
I mean, we have no idea where we are.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was just, capital E Earth.
Right.
It was just not a mappable location. It wasn't Iceland. It wasn't Oregon. It wasn't Hawaii. It was that to me starts to talk about, the human experience and how we map things and claim things. And I really wanted to have this thing step outside of all of that and just really be about the things that I was looking at.
And of course, you were able to it made sense to make really large prints and have an exhibition. I mean, this was work that was just perfect for gallery walls. I mean, ironically, it is also a book, so
yes,
you did not escape. Was it much easier to sequence?
No, I have to say it was actually the hardest book I've done for that reason.
Interesting. Yeah, because there's no narrative.
Yeah, it took me a while to find my way into it and quite a few false starts. This was the first body of work that I actually did exhibit before there was a book.
Right.
And Michael came out to LA and we looked at the show together, and we both sort of expressed an interest. Like, it would be an interesting challenge to see if this could be a book.
Yeah.
Although it seems to rely on scale. It seems to rely on so many other things that I don't usually incorporate in my books. But so that was yet another kind of question and a challenge. Like, can there be a way into this in the book form? And so, yeah, it was hard. It was really hard. I had a tough time with this one.
Well, you just can't get away from the book form. You're stuck.
Well, I have such an affinity for the book form also just
and
because
there's a hunger for it, right? Sorry to interrupt you, but there's a hunger for it from us, right? I mean, I didn't see the exhibit, and there's a hunger to get to engage with the work, and the photo book is the thing. I mean, we're not all able to, see the amount of exhibitions I want to see that I miss is astronomical and thousands of times more than the ones I actually get to see.
Well, that's always been a big part of it for me was, I grew up in and sort of even went to school in, pretty remote areas of the country. Mm-hmm. And books were always the way that I accessed work. That's how I, and this is pre-internet too, so it's like, that's how I knew about anybody really was through books. And as much as I love doing shows and I love the experience of seeing an exhibition and creating an exhibition, they're very fleeting.
They're very fleeting. Very few people see them. And, I can say, I'm sure you've had this experience that when folks come over to my place, there's books all over, and it just leads to discussion. People just automatically pick up a book.
Right.
Start looking through it. I mean, my place is a bit of a hangout, particularly for my artists that I represent, but also for friends and friends in and out of the industry. But people just immediately, because they're just piles everywhere, and they pick up a book and then they want to start talking about it. I mean, it's fantastic. It's just wonderful. I have way more conversations about photography that way than I do going to exhibitions with people. We have sort of these brief conversations and then it's sort of over. But there's something about sitting, on the couch looking
it's
through
a completely
book together.
different dynamic and a completely different way of engaging the work, I think. There's an intimacy to, books and also, you can take your time with them. You can revisit them.
Absolutely.
I think all of that's really important and the thing that I love about books. So it is hard to get away from it, and I feel so lucky that I actually get to do it.
Yeah, you are lucky.
That's another part of it too.
Well, on that wonderful note, Ron, thank you so much for being on today and talking about your life and your work. It's really been fun talking with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for asking me to do this. This is great. Thank you.
All right, Ron, take care.
All right. Bye, Sasha.
Bye.
PhotoWork with Sasha Wolf is produced by me, Michael Chauvin-Dalton of Real Photo Show. The associate producer is Taylor Selsback, and the executive producer is Sasha Wolf. Our theme music is by J. Walter Hawks. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe and rate us with all the stars available on your listening platform.